When people think about government overreach, they imagine wartime censorship, midnight raids, or soldiers in the streets. But the most devastating attack on American freedom happened in broad daylight, with the stroke of a pen on an ordinary spring day in 1933, and most Americans never saw it coming. On April 5, 1933, President Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 6102. With that signature, the United States government did something that would have been unthinkable to the Founding Fathers. It criminalized the private ownership of gold. Almost every form of monetary gold that Americans had accumulated over generations suddenly became illegal contraband. The order shattered the fundamental relationship between citizens and their government, and the lessons from that betrayal still echo through every economic crisis that followed. Let me paint you a picture of what America looked like before that fateful day. For over 150 years, gold had been the backbone of American money. Walk into any bank, hand over a $20 bill, and you could demand $20 worth of gold in return. The bank had to give it to you. That paper in your wallet wasn't really money at all. It was simply a receipt, a promise that you could exchange it for real money whenever you wanted. The Constitution itself, in Article 1, Section 10, explicitly forbids states from making anything but gold and silver legal tender. The Founding Fathers understood what history had taught them. Real money must be anchored to something real. This wisdom is captured in an economic principle called Gresham's Law, which states that bad money drives out good money. When people have a choice between real money and fake money, they'll save the real stuff and spend the fake. Think about it like this. If someone offered to pay you in either genuine $100 bills or monopoly money, which would you keep and which would you spend first? That's Gresham's Law in action. Paper could be printed endlessly. Promises could be broken with creative legal language, but gold remained gold. When Americans earned wages, they earned money backed by metal that had been valued across civilizations for thousands of years. When they saved for retirement, they accumulated something with inherent worth. And when they wanted to protect their wealth from government manipulation, they could literally hold that protection in their own hands. But running a modern government costs money, especially during a crisis. By 1933, America was deep into the Great Depression. Banks were failing at an alarming rate. Unemployment had reached 25%. Breadlines stretched around city blocks, and shanty towns called Hoovervilles sprouted up across the country. Roosevelt had promised a New Deal to fix everything, but ambitious government programs require enormous amounts of funding. Traditional taxation had limits. You can only squeeze taxpayers so hard before they revolt or the economy collapses entirely. Borrowing money also had constraints because lenders wanted confidence they'd be repaid in money worth something. But there was another way to fund government programs, a way that required breaking the link between money and gold. Here's the problem Roosevelt faced. As long as Americans could walk into any bank and demand gold in exchange for their paper dollars, the government couldn't simply print its way out of trouble. Try to create too much money, and people would start exchanging their paper for gold. The government's gold reserves would drain away, and the paper money would become worthless. Gold served as an anchor that kept monetary policy honest and limited government spending to what it could actually afford. Roosevelt decided that anchor had to go, but he couldn't just announce that America was abandoning gold-backed money. That would have caused immediate panic and economic collapse. Instead, he needed to separate Americans from their gold first, then change the monetary system afterward. Executive Order 6102 was the tool that made this possible. Executive Order 6102 was breathtaking in its scope and audacious in its violation of property rights. The order required virtually all Americans to surrender their gold coins, gold bullion, and gold certificates to the Federal Reserve by May 1, 1933. Citizens were given just 25 days to comply with what amounted to the largest seizure of private property in American history. The penalties for non-compliance were severe, up to 10 years in federal prison and a $10,000 fine. To put that fine in perspective, $10,000 in 1933 had the purchasing power of about $230,000 today. For most Americans, this fine alone would have meant financial ruin, even if they avoided prison time. The order did include some limited exceptions. Americans could keep $100 worth of gold coins, which sounds generous until you realize that $100 in 1933 gold coins would be worth about $2,300 today. Dentists could keep gold for fillings, jewelers could maintain reasonable stocks for their trade, and industries that used gold in manufacturing received permits. But these exceptions were narrow and heavily regulated. For ordinary citizens, the message was clear: surrender your gold or face the full weight of federal prosecution. Citizens were told this was patriotic, that their sacrifice was necessary for economic recovery. Government propaganda portrayed gold hoarding as unpatriotic and selfish. Americans were assured they would receive fair compensation, $20.67 per ounce, the official price that had been fixed since 1900. Most Americans, trusting their government and desperate for any solution to the economic crisis, complied with the order. But here's what makes this story so insidious. The government knew exactly what it planned to do next. The true scope of the betrayal became clear 9 months later. In January 1934, Roosevelt signed the Gold Reserve Act, which immediately raised the official price of gold from $20.67 to $35 per ounce. That's a 69% increase overnight. Let that sink in for a moment. Americans had been forced to sell their gold to the government at $20.67 per ounce in May 1933. 9 months later, that same government declared the gold was actually worth $35 per ounce. Every single ounce that had been confiscated was instantly worth 69% more in the government's hands than it had been worth in citizens' hands the day before. Why did this work so effectively? Because it exploited a fundamental monetary principle. Whoever controls the definition of money controls wealth itself. By forcing citizens to exchange real money for government promises, then immediately devaluing those promises relative to gold, Roosevelt had essentially imposed a 69% tax on American savings without ever calling it a tax. It was wealth confiscation disguised as monetary policy. Think about this from the perspective of an ordinary American family. Let's say John and Mary Thompson owned a small hardware store in Kansas. Like many prudent business owners, they had saved $1,000 worth of gold coins over 20 years of hard work. When Executive Order 6102 arrived, they had no choice but to turn in their gold and accept $1,000 in paper dollars. 9 months later, those same gold coins were officially worth $1,690 in the government's vaults. The Thompsons hadn't just lost their gold, they had been cheated out of $690 in purchasing power. Meanwhile, the government used that revaluation profit to fund New Deal programs. Private savings had been converted into public spending through legal theft. Not everyone accepted this quietly. Some Americans recognized the confiscation for what it was and tried to fight back through the courts. The most significant challenge came from Frederick Campbell, a prominent New York attorney who understood both law and economics. Campbell argued that the gold seizure violated the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution, which states that private property cannot be taken for public use without just compensation. His logic was straightforward. If the government immediately revalued gold upward by 69% after confiscating it, then clearly Americans had not received just compensation. They had been systematically underpaid for their property. Campbell's case, along with several similar challenges, made it to the Supreme Court in 1935. The legal issues were complex, involving questions of monetary sovereignty, property rights, and constitutional limits on government power. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that the highest court in the land might restore some protection for private property rights. But the Supreme Court ruled against Campbell and the other challengers by a narrow 5-4 margin. The majority decision established a precedent that still haunts American law today. When the government claims its monetary powers are at stake, individual property rights become secondary concerns. The Constitution's promise that private property shall not be taken without just compensation was effectively nullified when that taking served broader government economic policy. Justice James McReynolds wrote a scathing dissent, calling the majority decision confiscation and warning that such unlimited government powers could ultimately destroy constitutional protections entirely. His words proved prophetic. But 5 votes had already decided the matter. Roosevelt had promised that gold confiscation was temporary, an emergency measure needed only until the Depression ended, but temporary government powers have a way of becoming permanent fixtures. The ban on private gold ownership lasted for 41 years, not lifted until President Gerald Ford signed legislation in 1974 allowing Americans to own gold again. By 1974, an entire generation had grown up never knowing what it meant to hold real money. Parents couldn't pass down gold coins to their children because gold coins were illegal. Young adults entering the workforce had no concept that money had ever been anything more than whatever the government printed. The psychological transformation was complete. Americans had learned to trust paper currency, to believe in government monetary promises, and to forget that money had ever been anchored to anything tangible. But the damage went deeper than individual losses or even generational amnesia. The gold seizure broke something fundamental in the relationship between Americans and their government. For the first time in the nation's history, the federal government had declared war on private wealth accumulation in its most basic form. The precedent was established. Your savings belong to the state when the state decides it needs them. Your financial security depends entirely on government goodwill, and your constitutional rights can be suspended whenever economic necessity provides a convenient excuse. What does this mean for us today? The precedent for government wealth seizure remains not just legally established, but socially accepted. The legal framework, the Supreme Court blessing, and the public acceptance of emergency powers are all still in place, ready to be activated whenever financial pressure mounts. And if you think it can't happen again, look around. In 2013, Cyprus seized private bank deposits to bail out its failing financial system. Account holders woke up one morning to discover their savings had been bailed in to save the banks. In 2001, Argentina froze bank accounts and forcibly converted dollar deposits to devalued pesos. During the 2008 financial crisis, central banks around the world created trillions of new dollars, euros, and yen, diluting the value of every savings account and pension fund without asking permission from a single saver. The tools may look different, but the pattern remains identical to 1933. Governments facing financial pressure will always choose the path of least political resistance. They will seize private wealth to fund public promises. They will call it patriotic, necessary, temporary, and for the greater good. And they will count on citizens being too confused, too trusting, or too afraid to effectively resist. Consider what has happened since 1971, when President Nixon completely severed the dollar's connection to gold. The money supply has expanded by over 3,000%. The national debt has grown from $400 billion to over $33 trillion. The purchasing power of a dollar has fallen by more than 85%. Your paycheck, your savings account, your pension, all of it has been quietly confiscated through inflation just as surely as if government agents had knocked on your door demanding gold coins. Here's where it gets more troubling. Modern central banking has perfected what Roosevelt started. Today's Federal Reserve doesn't need to physically seize assets because it can achieve the same result through what economists call financial repression. By keeping interest rates below the inflation rate, they ensure that savers lose purchasing power every year their money sits in the bank. By expanding the money supply through quantitative easing, they inflate asset prices that benefit wealthy asset owners while eroding the wages that sustain everyone else. It's the same wealth transfer mechanism as 1933, just spread across decades instead of months. But you don't have to be a victim. The lesson that Americans learned too late in 1933 applies directly to today. Governments will always debase money when they need to fund promises they can't keep. The only reliable protection is holding wealth in forms that politicians cannot print, manipulate, or easily confiscate. Here's what this looks like in practical terms. First, understand that cash is not wealth. Cash is a claim on wealth that can be diluted through inflation at any time. Real wealth includes productive assets like businesses that generate income regardless of currency values, real estate that provides actual shelter and utility, commodities that satisfy genuine human needs, and precious metals that have stored value across civilizations and millennia. Second, diversify across jurisdictions. Don't keep all your wealth denominated in one country's currency or under one government's complete control. While Americans were forced to surrender their gold in 1933, citizens in other countries faced no such requirement. Today, that principle extends to international real estate, foreign business interests, and even digital assets stored across multiple jurisdictions. Third, develop skills and capabilities that remain valuable regardless of monetary systems. The ability to create, build, repair, or provide services that people genuinely need will preserve your economic position even when currencies collapse. These skills cannot be confiscated, devalued, or inflated away. The gold seizure also teaches us that timing matters. By the time confiscation orders are announced, it's too late to protect yourself. The wealthy Americans who preserved their wealth in 1933 were those who had already moved assets offshore or converted them to forms the government couldn't easily track or seize. The gold seizure of 1933 was not some historical aberration or Depression-era emergency measure. It was a blueprint for how governments rob their own citizens when financial pressures become unbearable. And with global debt at unprecedented levels, central banks creating money at rates that would have shocked even Roosevelt, and economic instability growing each year, those pressures are mounting again. Roosevelt told Americans that surrendering their gold was patriotic. What he didn't tell them was that they were surrendering their financial independence forever. The government had discovered it could seize private wealth through legal mechanisms, and once that precedent was established, there was no going back. Don't make the same mistake twice. Understand that your government sees your savings as a resource to be tapped when convenient. Recognize that emergency powers, once granted, are rarely returned. And remember that the Constitution's promises of property protection mean nothing when judges decide that government economic policy trumps individual rights. History doesn't repeat exactly, but the patterns remain remarkably consistent. If you don't learn from 1933, you'll discover that some betrayals never really end. They just wait for the next crisis to emerge. If this opened your eyes to what your government is truly capable of, hit subscribe. History has the warnings, and I'll show you how to see them coming.